Okay, so welcome to the 1970s. We're taking a quick tour here of the 70s, and really the issue surrounding the 1970s in America is a challenge to previously what had been highly optimistic, really prestigious, and a strong spirit in America in the 50s and the 60s after World War II. But the 70s really becomes a bit of a challenge and a crisis where people begin to really question this optimism and prestige in the American spirit. And so first we're going to talk about domestic issues, so things happening in the country, and then in our second video we'll talk about things outside of the country. So first is feminism. A quick reminder, way back when we were talking about the progressive era and even before that, that women began to protest and mostly focused on the ability to vote, right? Suffrage. And that really they took their playbook from abolitionist movement, the issue to try to get rid of slavery. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as a lot of other ladies, worked and are successful in getting women the right to vote. A whole second generation or second wave of women come in the 1950s to the 70s, and they focus on a much more difficult task, and that is ending discrimination in a social setting and giving women economic opportunities, so an equal workplace and being considered equal in society. And really, they take the playbook from the civil rights movement. And so Betty Friedman is a huge leader in that push. And the women's rights movement really begins to have some different veins that I want to highlight. So one is liberal feminism. And so they highlighted that the Equal Economic Opportunities Commission, whose job was to enforce basically job equality, really failed. And so the National Organization of Women is created or begins to really push for things like getting women on juries in the courts and integrating classifieds, which is when jobs used to be posted in newspapers. They still are, but really that's probably going to be a thing of the past here soon. And integrated workforce. This is something that women really began to push for, that women should be able to be included in all areas of the workplace, not just being a telephone operator. So AT&T famously loses a discrimination suit where women sued to have jobs just beyond kind of an entry-level position. And so women can now work and play in most places. This leads us to our next one. Title IX was a law passed in '72, and it highlights that women and men cannot have discrimination in educational setting, and really so anything that receives federal funds. And this becomes a huge issue in sports. Previously, sports was a pretty male-dominated part of the educational situation, and so now men and women's funding has to be completely equal. So we see a lot more women athletes today than ever before. Moving on, in '72, ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, is trying to be passed by women so that there's an official recognition in the Constitution that there's an inherent equality between men and women that should be constitutionally enforced. That gets shot down. It never actually passes. And there's a huge backlash. Not all women agree that this feminism is a good idea. So Shafley and the Stop ERA organization or campaign really tries to promote that women should stay at home and families should be are threatened by this sort of stuff, and that segregation is actually good because it protects women. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. And now there's another vein, radical feminism. And so really some disaffected civil rights veterans like Stokely Carmichael push to have women equal in society. And so these women were really famous for some of the more outlandish attempts they get to draw people's attention towards the women's rights movement. And so bra burning and high heels getting broken up, and even changing the spelling of women to get out the men part, and so spelling it kind of phonetically. So women would often trash their bras or high heels and burn them. And they also protest or picket the Miss America pageant, which is a long American tradition, and really begin to highlight the fact that they see the Miss American pageant as really almost like a cattle show, right? Showing off different body parts and judging women essentially on that. And so they say that this would be an indication of that American society focuses way too much on women's looks and not enough on their brains. A huge other movement is started in the 70s, and that's the environmental movement. This continues today. So America begins to sprawl out with suburbia and uses of dangerous and harmful detergents, and an increase in energy consumption really begins to come to an head, and people realize that we can't just burn through all kinds of resources without some consequences. This is really highlighted in a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson in 1962, and this highlights the issue of pesticides and really the environmental impacts that some of those had that weren't really friendly to the environment. Also, issues like an oil spill in Santa Barbara off the coast of California, lots of oil in the water and dead dolphins becomes a national point. And so the president acts. And in 70, Nixon and the Congress put together Earth Day and the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and the Clean Air Act, all to try to improve the environment and the pollution that America is putting out. And so one of the big pushes was try to regulate emissions, right? What comes out as a result of industrial processes like driving your car or in factories, and especially in urban areas. We can see smog here, right, in LA, and a lot of these are still, the fight continues to today. And in 65, though, going backwards a little bit, there was a huge case, the Scenic Hudson versus the Federal Power Commission, in which aesthetics, so just the natural environment, was enough of a concern that it should not be overrun simply by political or economic demands. So this was, they wanted to dam up part of the Hudson River in New York, and people were highly against this, and they actually won. Major court cases that still define America to this day are Roe v. Wade. So the issue of abortion, a little background that abortions have been criminalized since the Civil War to World War I, and a lot of this was seen as trying to, immigrants were outstripping white people as far as the population, and midwives were stealing doctors' patients, so no abortions were allowed at that time legally. And Griswold versus Connecticut in 65 sets down a precedent of protecting individuals' rights and of privacy and contraception. So people have the freedom to keep their private life private, and the freedom to use contraception in whatever way they see fit. And the layout is this: the first trimester, keeping a pregnancy is between, the decision is between a man, or a woman and a doctor. The second one needs medical approval, and a third one really needs to show immediate harm. There's been some changes recently, which maybe we'll talk about in class, but the issue of abortion is still really a hot button issue. And Bakey versus UC Regents really touches on the 14th Amendment, and basically that guy who just disappeared stated that he got discriminated against, reverse discrimination essentially, that he wasn't accepted in the medical program at UC or the University of California because he was white. And so there was this issue between economics and education and disadvantaged people, and essentially the Supreme Court says in a 5-4 ruling that race can be a factor but not the only factor, and that quotas need to be excluded. So a certain number of spots shouldn't be held for minorities of kind of any race. Another pretty significant issue was Watergate. This is named after the Watergate Hotel, and the general story is President Nixon, it's found out later, orders some people to break in. This is a famous file cabinet that they broke into, the Democratic Party office in the Watergate Hotel. And eventually it's kind of figured out these two reporters, Bob and Carl from the Washington Post, have an informant named Deep Throat who changes their voice to protect their identity. And really this becomes a national crisis. Once again, a threat to America's prestige. Now the president, even the president of the United States, is not above corruption. So this is a really bad decade for America in a lot of people's eyes. In 73, the Senate establishes a committee to investigate it, and They find out that there were tape recordings of a lot of this issue going down to the White House, and there's this battle over whether Congress can get these tapes, and ultimately they win and the president loses, and because of that, Nixon, because it's likely he would then impeached, begins his resignation. He becomes the first president to quit his job. And another part that really defines the 60s and in the 70s is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Pretty common phrase. And so rock and roll, at least in its classical sense, begins to stagnate towards 59. And the emergence of a lot of classic bands that you probably are familiar with, the Beatles and Dylan and Queen, as well as the radio, really promote this musical style, as well as it makes a lot of money. So in America, that really ultimately means a whole lot. So in 70, we can see a $2 billion industry, 80% of it's going to rock. So this changing musical style is really profitable, as well as drugs were popular, at least the idea of them. And so kind of a new drug culture emerges. And really, Ben Kingsley and the Merry Pranksters, this is part of their journey. He writes a book really highlighting issues like drugs and nudity, and this becomes an emerging part of the American culture. As well as the DEA is formed because of all these drugs, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and they really target a drug in particular. Actually, let me go back, too many clicks. And that is marijuana, becomes kind of their historical target, although that's changing more recently. And so there's some propaganda. If you want to YouTube, we don't have time for it. Reefer Madness, there's a video out there, and you can see what the government was trying to convince young people of in the 70s, as well as sex and issues of same genders, or different genders in college facilities living together, so different floors, what's called co-ed. The advent of the pill to prevent pregnancy also furthers this issue of sex in America, as well as cohabitation, that larger and larger numbers of people begin to live together before being married in off-campus housing. So here's Life magazine highlighting this issue. And the Summer of Love really pushes this idea of a counterculture, a very different way of living. The Summer of Love in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, that's kind of the mecca of hippies. Stagflation, there's economic problems in the 70s. There's no real productivity increase, while prices begin to increase significantly. So inflation really soars in the 70s significantly. 14% inflation is really huge, and America's economy begins to shift to a service economy. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and we have to compete globally now with the Germans and the Japanese for things like cars and steel and TVs, and we're left with things like McDonald's. So we can see over time, though, America has begun to be really competitive once again, that the output per worker is really increased since the 70s. And lenders really start to put on pretty high interest rates to protect themselves, and what that ends up meaning is really less borrowing means less jobs for the American economy. And we can see also the gas crisis. There's an energy crisis in the 70s. The price of gas jumps significantly, and then even more. So there's huge gas lines, which we'll see a little bit later on in our second video. And now some pop culture stuff. I'll give somebody some extra credit if they can name all of these things and bring them to me in class, all these pop culture references. So what are these two pieces of technology? I want you to name this band, and this band, and this one. Check that dude out. All right, and now a couple other things. What video game is this? Pretty classic. As well as what TV show. And now some movies, right? What movie is this? And that. These are all pretty classics. And this. And that one might be the hardest one. So quickly, some review. So if you don't think you can correctly identify any of these terms, feminism down to the stagflation, really I would go back and review. But feminism, this idea of women's movement in a very different way. Equal Rights Amendment, trying to make that happen in the Constitution. National Women of National Organization of Women, trying to push that forward. Title IX, equality in sport, Silent Spring, issues